Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we're going to have a quick update on the wrecker. This video is being done in a bit of a hurry as I'm currently getting bits ready for the Southern Scale Trail. Unfortunately, in my haste I managed to completely screw up the camera settings, but the footage was mostly salvageable and I don't really have enough time to re-record it, so here we are. Anyway, that's all a bit boring, so let's get on with the video. Right. This truck is set up with a Tamiya MFC 03, a nice light, sound and ESC box that makes a good noise and generally once set up works pretty well. Its main shortcoming is the control scheme. Just like the early Tamiya boxes, it's still designed around a twin stick radio with 4 channels and analog trims. You have to remember stick movements and trim positions to activate the functions, which needless to say is a pain in the rear. A lot of people with MFCs only ever seem to use the basic functions. To start the engine, we have to move the right stick down to the bottom, for example. In the manual, there's several pages of stick diagrams and text showing all of the combinations. Now, it would be much easier if we could use all the extra channels most radios have, and even use a wheel radio rather than sticks. This is only 6 channel, but some radios have 16 or more to play with. On this one we have the wheel for steering, the trigger for throttle, plus there's 2 toggle switches and 2 buttons, which should be plenty for all of the basic controls. But it's not really practical to map all the stick movements. We can't really use the 3 position switches in the place of the sticks, as some functions need a half movement, or full movement plus trims that need to be all the way over too. So this is where this little widget comes in. What we've got is essentially an Arduino with a NRF24L01 data radio on a custom breakout board. It uses a receiver module that's compatible with the wheel transmitter and takes control of the MFC. With all the other gubbins plugged in, it can pretend to be the stick radio with its 4 channels, plus it can manage a whole load of other things too. The steering and indicators aren't tied together. It can look after the boom lift and with some more bits attached can manage an extra 72 LED channels. This setup is pretty well tied to this particular truck. However, I'm working on a simpler version that's a bit less of a rat's nest. So back to the wheel radio and the bad camera settings. We have the throttle and the steering as you'd expect. Then the first 3 position does the 3-speed gearbox. The second 3 position selects the current camera, more on that later. On the handle, the big button sounds the horn, and the little button at the top flashes the headlights. All quite straightforward without having to remember what combination of sticks to stir. But what about all the other functions? Remember, there's a second radio on the control board, which talks to this handset. Very much a prototype with all the electronics hanging in the breeze, plus a battery that would probably last a couple of years between charges, but it does get us running. There's a display that tells us what's happening, and to use a function we just press a button and it does what the label says. Remember, to start the engine is right stick down, but on this we just press the start engine button and the electronics on the truck take care of everything else. Out on the layout we can start up the truck. Now I've already connected up the battery and the transmitter is turned on. So first we need to power up the controller and the boom lift and wait a few seconds for it all to power up. Then under the frontmost door we can turn on the MFC 03 and let it complete its startup sequence. Right, and now we can close the door and hit the engine start button. Close the door over the control panel and the truck's ready to drive. So far only marginally better than a stock MFC setup. This does get a bit more interesting though when we look at all the extra functions. We have the running lights or side markers. Now usually these are just covers for the side panel mounting screws, but when we built this truck we added LEDs in each of the holes, and with the controller each one can be controlled individually. That means we have some brightness settings. We can add a wigwag, Then if we want some more attention, we can add a strobe to the wigwag too. There's also an animation mode that I completely forgot to film, but we'll see that in action as the truck does some drive-bys in just a minute. For the MFC lights, we just need to press the MFC lights button to cycle through the modes. I think on a stick radio that would be the right stick all the way down, but with the trims all the way down too. The single button is just much easier. The extra lights and effects aren't just for the side markers. You can set up any of the functions on any of the lights. The front beacons have the same brightness levels, but if we hit the wigwag and the front beacon button, they wigwag. Then we can do wigwag and strobe, followed by the front beacon button again for the strobing wigwag. And lastly, we can press animate and front beacons. All the other extra lights have a similar setup appropriate for their layout. There's pretty much a combination for every occasion. The plan is to have a special mode that will randomly pick a combination and change it every few minutes for a static display, so the truck can be connected to a power supply and left on a bench doing its own thing, trying its best to attract some visitors. Another feature is the on-truck settings. Now, I've not implemented many of these just yet, well, 2, but there's going to be more to come. First is a setting that ties the rear-facing work lights to the reverse lights. 0 is just normal MFC reverse lights, 1 lights up the rearmost work lights, and 2 lights up all the work lights with reverse. Mainly useful for the onboard cameras in a dimly lit room, not terribly useful otherwise. The second is rev slow. Now, because the wheel radios have a 70-30 ratio on the throttle, rather than a 50-50 of a stick radio, reverse can be extremely sensitive. When it's set to 1, it essentially limits the reverse speed to something manageable, while still allowing full brake. If you're using a 50-50 throttle, you'd just set it to 0. If we take a look under the roof, you can see some of the wiring. At the front is a module that lets us switch between the 3 cameras. All 3 are fairly well hidden. There's a front-facing and 2 rear-facing. The output of the switch connects to a 25mW 5.8 gig video transmitter, which is plenty for the typical indoor layout. Also up front of the roof is the wiring for the 13 LEDs. They connect to a PCB with some small JST connectors, so the roof can be removed fairly easily. Refitting the roof is another story though. Sometimes the wires find the perfect position and get trapped between the magnets, so it can be a bit of a faff to get it to sit down nicely. I'll have to work on that a bit off camera. At the back of the roof there's the video transmit antenna. Now for general use it works just fine, but we can always swap it for a higher gain antenna on some stiff coax for a bit more range if we're on a larger layout. Moving to the onboard footage, and we can drive around. First is the front camera, which is mounted behind the windscreen high up. It's a CADX of some sort, I can't remember which one, other than it's pretty small. Chosen purely because the windscreen's tinted, so we need a camera that could deal with the lower light better than the low-cost security cameras. At the back we have a high-level rear-facing camera, which is useful for reversing in tight spaces. And lastly, right at the back, we can see the lift and get a good feel for how close things are when reversing up to a wall. The front camera, as well as being a bit better in low light, is also super wide angle. Important as pulling out of a junction can be a bit tricky at best with a fixed camera. So the more you can see, the better. And with this setup, we can almost see the full width of the window. Short of a pan servo, it's about as good as it gets. There's always going to be a compromise with onboard cameras. Ideally the camera would have an unrestricted view, but that loses out to the scale side of things. In this build we kept the cameras as compact as possible so they're well hidden. It's only really the roof antenna that gives it away, and I'm sure most people probably wouldn't know what that is anyway. There's still a sizable to-do list to do for the wrecker. We need to fit a beck for the steering servo, as the MFC 03's beck is struggling a bit. The voltage sag is causing some issues elsewhere. There's the bright work to add, door handles, steps and all that good stuff. We also need to work out the rest of the livery, so we need to get designing and get some vinyl cut. And I think we might end up with some different wheels too. I'm sure we'll come up with some more along the way as well. These projects always have a habit of going on a little bit longer than planned. Either way, that's about it for this week. If you want to find out more about the indoor track meets and have a look at some pics, go to outbacktruckers.com and have a look around. As always, thanks for watching, like if you like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!